Jag tänkte så att vi kanske skulle omgruppera så att vi sitter i solarna och Hans står här och pratar. För det blir ett väldigt konstigt ljud om vi ska ha mikrofonen där. Det blir någon slags dubbeleffekt som gör att det är svårt att höra. Så kan vi göra det? En snabb omgruppering.
God morgon! Välkomna till denna fördjupningsupplevelse Bach-dag. Jag står här i två egenskaper då, och den ena är som konstnärlig ledare för Göteborgs ORGEL-festival. Och som jag sa igår, vi gläder oss enormt över detta samarbete. Att få stiftets musiker engagerade i detta Bach-projekt. Det fina initiativ som Ulrika tog och som kan få bli också öppning på ORGEL-festivalen. Den andra rollen som jag har idag, den är viktig idag, är att jag har fått uppdraget att vara lite grann av moderator för de tankar som kommer att förmedlas kring Bach utav våra gäster. Ruth Tatlow, Robin Lever kommer om en kvart. Och jag gör en liten introduktion, sen kommer Robin Lever att vara första föredragshållaren och Ruth Tatlow den andra. Vi får en liten paus där 11:15. Sen kommer Masaki Suzuki klockan 11. Och då kommer vi föra ett samtal där jag också hoppas att ni, om ni har frågor, funderingar, kan komma in i det här. Det blev ju lite ändringar igår. Vi har haft lite olika schemaupplägg och det berodde ursprungligen på det faktum att det är väldigt svårt att bedöma hur mycket tid behöver man för repetitioner. Och jag tror att ni alla har den erfarenheten att innan man vet hur det låter, innan man har lärt känna varandra och allt det där, så tänker man, oj, vi måste ju se till att vi har tillräckligt med tid. Och så, ja, reserverar man mer än man kanske i verkligheten, när det nu var så underbar stämning och fina resultat som vi går och känner att man behöver. Och jag kan då säga att när jag pratade med Ruth och med Robin så tyckte jag att det var fantastiskt roligt att få berätta om sin forskning, sitt arbete med Bach för er. Huvudsakligen för de som är intresserade kommer hit idag, men de tyckte att det var väldigt svårt i så korta avsnitt som 20 minuter på eftermiddagen och så som det stod i det ursprungliga programmet. Så egentligen så är de ganska glada även om de får upp på morgonen och vara här över att få lite mer tid och tala om Bach. Och det som vi ska göra idag är då att fira reformationen med Bachs perspektiv och ingångar i hans musik på olika sätt. Och för några veckor sedan hade jag förmånen att vara i Liinason, Luther och musik som Mattias Lundberg med sitt team där uppe organiserade. Och det var forskare från hela världen, engagerade kyrkomusiker, huvudsakligen lutheraner, men en fantastisk manifestation och möte över 3 dagar. I den inledande föreläsningen så betonar den tyske keynote-speakern betydelsen av ur Luthers perspektiv då, ordet, texten å ena sidan och musiken å andra sidan. Och det var väldigt intressant att höra hur Luthers tankar visade på att han, ni vet det här, näst teologin så är musiken den främsta gåvan till oss. Men liksom bakom det, att han menar ju att Guds ord med andens verkan får en kraftpresens i våra liv. Men han menar också att musiken som gåva från Gud har en kraft att gå in i oss, i vårt inre, i vårt själ, i vårt hjärta och emotionellt på andra nivåer än det rationella intellektuella få oss att uppleva och förstå. Och så betonade han då i förord till en samling som han skrev, Luther, alltså den rapporterat här i föreläsningen, att när text och tro, när Guds ord och musiken förenas, då blir det en ännu djupare förståelse som sträcker sig längre än vad vi med vårt förstånd kan fånga. Och Luther såg i musiken som med den kraft den har sig själv nog, att musiken i sig själv också hade en möjlighet att tala liksom ordet till oss som människor, att få oss att uppleva, berika, förstå, där orden inte kan fånga det, där orden tar slut av musiken vid. Under tiden reformationen, första årtiondena som var fokus i Uppsala, så var det här med polyfonmusik det som dominerade, med cantus firmus och reflekterande kosmos och liksom verkande i oss. Sen blev det under 1600-talet så att den nya musiken, operan, sekunda praktika som vi säger, kom in både i Sydeuropa i den katolska kyrkan och genom till exempel organister som Mattias Beckman i Hamburg i kyrkomusiken i den lutherska kyrkan. Det fanns en öppenhet, en plats, tack vare perspektivet som Luther hade, för att man skulle kunna integrera, föra in detta. Och samtidigt var det då en utveckling där Luthers uppmaning till att musiken skulle ge en aktiv möjlighet för församlingen. Det är det som är så speciellt i den lutherska kyrkan, att vara med, att delta, att agera i gudstjänsten. Och där kommer ju koralen, psalmen in och dyker upp i vokalinstrumentalmusiken. Och orgeln får en annan gestaltning, får en annan uppbyggnad, en annan klanginriktning. Det här är ett väldigt spännande perspektiv från en utvecklingstid där Bach kommer in i den nordtyska traditionen med sin lärare Georg Böhm, med möjligheten när han studerar i Lüneburg att se hela det nordtyska, om vi kallar det perspektivet. Han sitter och kopierar i musik och källor, och sen några år vet vi att han kände till Bokskogens stora koralfantasi. Han studerade italienarna. Det var en otroligt viktig roll när man studerade som lärling. Det var inte bara musikhögskola, utan man kom in som sångare och blev apprentice. Och varje organist som hade stature och ansvar för att utbilda kyrkomusiker så hade ju några lärlingar. Då assisterade man och studerade musik och var med i allting. Och så tog man naturligtvis alla tillfällen man hade att studera. Och Bach hade sina rötter i den här traditionen, kände till allt det som vi kommer tala om idag som organistmusik och utvecklade detta vidare. Men när vi börjar idag i Gustav i domkyrkan så tycker jag det känns viktigt att tänka på att vi har ett jubileum då år sedan Frida André blev världens första kvinnliga domkyrkoorganist. Hon föddes 1841 och verkade mer än 60 år i Göteborg. Dog 1929, hade varit sjukskriven några år, men hon var en kraftfull kulturpersonlighet som alltså var domkyrkoorganist i mer än 60 år. Det var 1867, efter 7 års idoga försök att komma in i yrkesuppgifter som då inte hade varit öppna för kvinnor, där hon var med och öppnade dörrar som hon kunde bli domkyrkoorganist. Hon började att försöka öppna yrket som telegrafist. Och det tog henne 4 år. Hennes fars grej först 1860 var att en kvinna skulle kunna få detta väldigt nya möjlighet att arbeta som telegrafist. Nej, det gick inte. 62 nytt försök. 64 lyckades hon få till en lagändring som möjliggjorde att en kvinna kunde anställas som telegrafist. 1867 så blev hon då domkyrkoorganist i Göteborg. Och det där har Eva Börström, forskare, skrivit om. Fridas roll som domkyrkoorganist var en väldigt viktig sak. Hon utbildade musiker, det fanns massor plötsligt av kvinnor som gick in som organister. Min mormor berättade för mig när hon var i Tyska kyrkan, hörde till domkyrkoförsamlingen här, Hildur heter hon, att vi var i kören och vi satt där och då kom, det var inte alltid så lätt, det var fröken Brattberg som var organisten, hon var student till Frida André, och så kom prosten in så att fan, där uppe sitter fröken Brattberg och kvintilerar. Så det var ju alltså, naturligtvis ett pionjärarbete att stå upp och vara i den tjänsten. Och hennes insats där behöver lyftas upp, betraktas och inspirera idag ännu mer. Hon arbetade som folkbildare i Göteborg. Hon organiserade mer än 800 konserter. Det här som när jag växte upp fortsatte under rubriken Arbetarinstitutets konserter med orkesterföreningar och sånt där. Det var en enorm insats som folkbildare, som kulturutövare, som entreprenör. Och där tänker jag, här sitter ni, kyrkomusiker, kollegor, i denna tradition. Som utövare, som pedagoger, som ensembleledare, som inspiratörer, som entreprenörer i kyrkomusiken, musikens, kulturens tjänst. Vilken fantastisk uppgift vi har. Och denna dagen är en alldeles särskild samling, inspiration, utgångspunkt för allt vad ni gör. Med de orden skulle jag vilja... ja, visst. Kaffe 10 var bra. Vad tänker vi på det?
Ja, precis. Så du får den.
Ja, visst. So, good morning. So, thank you very much for joining us a bit earlier than planned today to the development of this project by allowing us a little more time. And I thought, if you would mind, Så eftersom inte alla har det här programmet för Göteborgs Orgelfestival där det står biografier om våra gäster, så tänkte jag att jag faktiskt tar lite tid och läser så ni förstår vilka fantastiska människor och kollegor vi har bland oss här. Robin Lever, professor emeritus av Sacred Music at Westminster Choir College i Princeton i New Jersey utanför New York. Och han är honorary professor of Queen's University in Belfast. Han har undervisat liturgi, på Drew University, New Jersey. Han har lett Bach Studies at Juilliard School, New York. Och många kurser inriktade på Bach, musikhistoria och hymnologi vid det som kallas Institute for Sacred Music at Yale University, som ligger norr om New York. Han är mycket aktiv internationellt, studerar i England, kommer därifrån och har en doktorsexamen från Groningen i Nederländerna vid Rijksuniversitet. Han har varit president för både den internationella arbetsgemenskapen, kallar man det för, hymnologi, och det amerikanska Bach Society. Han är författare till ett stort antal böcker, artiklar och naturligtvis i uppslagsverk, många entrances. Och hans speciella områden, som ni förstår då, är liturgi, kyrkomusik, teologi, hymnologi. Och han har publicerat faktiskt i fyra olika världsdelar litteratur som är inriktad på Luther, Schütz och Bach. De senaste är en bok som heter Luther's Liturgical Music, Principles and Implications från 2007 och Exploring Bachs B Minor Mass, H-mollmässan, en fördjupad studie i det, 2013. Och så har han skrivit The Routledge Research Companion to Johann Sebastian Bach. The Whole Church Sings, Congregational Singing in Luther's Wittenberg, 2017, Bach and the Counterpoint of Religion, som håller på att förberedas. Och på lördag, det vill säga imorgon, så kommer han att berätta vidare om det här med psalmsång och ackompanjemang av psalmsång. Så vi får en föreläsning med demonstration i Örgryte nya kyrka med sitt i orgeln, där man kan se hur psalmsångsackompanjemang har utvecklats under tiden. Och sen är det en stor psalmsångskonsert klockan 12 i Örgryte. So it's a great pleasure. Thank you very much for being with us, to have you here. And as you can see, you have church musicians, organists from all of our dioceses here in the choir, which is a bit of an experiment and provides this wonderful opportunity to share perspectives on Johann Sebastian Bach with us and music.
Thank you. Thank you for your welcome. I don't know what he said about me, but I hope it was good, and some of it will be true. I started this whole business with Bach with people like you. At the age of 7, I was inveigled to sing in the local church choir, and among the first things I ever sang were some of the choruses from Bach's cantatas. And that started me off on a wonderful journey of exploring the music of Bach, and indeed much of my life has been devoted to that, but it started with people like you who encourage younger people to encounter not only Bach but other music as well, but what you do is really very important. So you've asked me to speak about Bach and Luther this morning. Actually, you asked me to do it this afternoon, but I'll do it this morning. Bach had to have been aware of Luther at a very early age. As you know, he was born in Eisenach, where Luther spent some time in his youth. And there is a house in Eisenach that would have been pointed out to the young Bach as to where Luther would have lived when he was a boy. Bach also went to the same Latin school that Luther had attended in Eisenach 200 years earlier. And you can be sure that the teachers pointed out to their pupils this connection with Luther. No child going to that school would ever be without the knowledge that they were going to the same school that Martin Luther attended. Then, as a schoolboy, Bach sang in the choir of the parish church of St. George, where Luther again had sung before him, where he learned to sing Luther's hymns, where he learned Luther's small catechism, which was also used in the home, of course. And then, perched on a rugged mountain just behind Eisenach, is the Wartburg. The Wartburg, the castle where Luther was taken for his own safety after his appearance at the Diet of Worms. And it's here that Luther wrote some of his most significant treatises that strongly influenced the progress of the Reformation. Arguably the most important being his translation of the New Testament into German, published towards the end of 1522. Now, no one growing up in Eisenach then, or I would think now, would have not known about the connections with Martin Luther. Then, at some point of his life, Bach was interested enough in the writings of Martin Luther to purchase the collected works of the Reformer. And we know this because when Bach died, he left a significant library of books. Most of them, all of them, theological. Bible commentaries, collections of sermons, some polemic works, but it's very clear that his favorite author was Martin Luther. He had more books by Luther than anyone else in his library. Now, we presume that he either bought or was given the Jena edition, German edition of Luther's writings at an early stage of his career. All the works, or most of the works of Luther were presented in 8 fat volumes in a chronological sequence from the earliest to the latest, though there are some notable omissions in this collection. Now, we know that he must have had this copy. It's listed in the list of his books when he died, and we assume that he had it early in his career because in the year 1742 he buys another set of the collected works of Luther, because there is an auction receipt that shows that he went to an auction and he purchased this other set of Luther's works. This time it was the Altenburg edition, the Altenburg German edition of Luther's writings. Essentially, it was a reprint of the Jena edition with some extra works included. So we presume that he already had the Jena edition, but with the addition of the distinctive difference between the Altenburg edition and the Jena edition is that the old Jena edition didn't have the vast commentary on the book of Genesis that Luther was involved in the last years of his life. So it seems that Bach was willing to have to get duplicate copies of Luther's writings so that he could have access to the great Genesis commentary, plus 1 or 2 extra works that were not in the old Jena edition. But also, by purchasing this set of Luther's writings, he then was keeping up with where the theologians were in his day, because this is the edition of Luther's writings that all the theologians would quote from, the Altenburg edition. So Bach was keeping up to date. But he also had some of these writings of Luther in other volumes, especially the massive Bible commentary edited by Abraham Kaloff, 6 folio volumes bound together as 3 very fat volumes that are now in the library of Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. And these are the only books, the actual books, because Bach has put his monogram on the title pages, these are the only books that have survived from his personal library. Where the other volumes went, we don't know. But these volumes are important because of the fact that he underlined various passages in the commentary. And he entered in a few marginal comments about the nature and the function of music. Think about it. Here are these fat volumes. Bach has them open. He has a Bible open alongside. And it's interesting that these marginal comments tell us that he's looking up those references to music. And he will make underlinings, and then in 4 places he adds a comment. Now you ask yourself, why did he do this, and who did he expect to see it? Nobody other than himself. This is what we do when we have books and we write marginal notes in them to remind ourselves. So it tells us a lot about Bach. However, what is often missed is that Karlov's commentary, this vast commentary on the whole of Scripture, is really another edition of Luther's writings. Because this theologian, Abraham Karlov, was the senior professor in Wittenberg in the late 17th century. He was the superintendent of the churches in and around Wittenberg. He wrote an enormous amount of commentaries, a lot of polemic works, and his enemies, particularly Catholics, called him the Pope of Wittenberg. Very important guy, very interesting guy too. But what he did was he took scissors and glue and in effect cut up the collected works of Luther and stuck them down again, but in the sequence of the Bible, from Genesis through to Revelation. So giving Luther's works in biblical order. And Karlov only supplied his own commentary on a passage if he couldn't locate a suitable comment from Luther. So for some writings of Luther, Bach had access to 3 different sources in his personal library. And then for a few writings, especially commentaries on the Psalms, he had no less than 4 different sources for these texts, which you could find the same words of Luther. The 2 collected works of Luther, the Karlov Deutsche Bible, Bible commentary, but he also owned 1 volume of the Wittenberg edition, the earlier Wittenberg edition of Luther's works, the volume that is almost exclusively commentaries on the Psalms, which is significant since much of Bach's settings in the cantatas are words from the Psalms. But Bach had other Luther volumes as well, such as the Tischreden, the Table Talk, the collection of the varied sayings of Luther at table and elsewhere, picked up by his colleagues and his students. A volume that gathered together some of the most significant sayings of the Reformer. You may know how this worked. Luther was always saying pertinent things, even at the dinner table. And his students would sit around the edge of the room with pencil and paper and would jot down these nuggets of Luther's thinking. And then they were collected together in this vast volume, the Tischreden. Well, Bach had a copy of that. Bach also owned two different editions of Luther's Hauspostille, that is, the church year sermons on the epistles and gospels of the church year, a collection that were intended for the laity to read. And it seems that the only significant work by Luther that Bach did not have personal access to was Luther's Kirchenpostille, the church year sermons that was intended for the clergy as a guide to their preaching. But even here, Bach was not without some access to the substance of these sermons, because only a brief encounter with the Karlov Bible commentary will demonstrate that one of Karlov's primary sources was Luther's Kirchenpostille, which he quotes at great length throughout the whole commentary. So you can say that Bach had access almost to everything or most of what Luther had written. Bach had access to, sometimes in multiple copies, in his own personal library. That is significant. But there were other books in Bach's personal library that drew attention to the content and the influence of Luther's theology, especially in contrast to Catholicism. Such books include Johann Müller, who wrote a book called Lutheris Defensus, a chap called Franz Kling wrote Warnung vor Abfall der lutherischen Religion, and Philipp Jakob Spener, Eifer wider das antichristische Papsttum. Didn't pull any punches in those days. But that's not a collection of what you would expect from the leader of pietism at the time. These are sermons by Spener when he was the court preacher in Dresden, and they are sermons that were preached on Reformation Day, 31st of October, in several years. So that, and they're not pietistic. They are like any Orthodox preacher would have done at the time. Very interesting. And of course, being Reformation Day sermons, they're praising Luther's accomplishments. When we turn to Bach's music, we find that there are significant connections with Luther. In the vocal works, there are remarkable settings of two of Luther's most famous hymns, Christ lag in Todesbanden and Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott. I think you know something about these two? Yep. Cantata 4 and Cantata 80, which we are very much involved in today. Of course, one of the earliest and most significant cantatas Bach composed is Cantata 4, which is a musical exposition of Luther's Easter hymn, Christ lag in Todesbanden, and it was probably composed for his first Easter after his return to Arnstadt, from his visit to Lübeck, where he went to hear the music of Dietrich Buxtehude. He went there in order to quote his explanation to the superintendent in Arnstadt, he went there, quote, to comprehend one thing and another about my art, unquote. The cantata, I think, there's not unanimity about this, but the cantata, I think, was composed for Easter Day 1707, when Bach was just 22 years old. There are various dates suggested for this work, but if you look at the comments that are made by the scholars, the date has been gradually going earlier and earlier. it seems to me that 1707 is the most likely date because this was immediately following his trip to Lübeck and his encounter with the music of Buxtehude, and there are strong reminiscences in the music of Cantata 4 to the music of Buxtehude. Yeah, so Bach is just 22 years old. Isn't it annoying that this young guy at that age could write such incredible music? I mean, you could be picky and say that the counterpoint is not quite as developed as some of his later cantatas are, but it's still an amazing cantata. This is when he was the organist of the Neue Kirche in Arnstadt. Each stanza of Luther's sturdy hymn is interpreted in sound as the composer sought to give the meaning of Luther's hymn in musical form, stanza by stanza. It is a truly remarkable work, which Bach performed again several times in later years, especially during his early years when he was in Leipzig, 1724, and again in 1725. Then there's that other hymn. In Bach's day, Luther's classic hymn, Ein Festeburg, had not yet received the veneration it was accorded in the 19th century and thereafter, though it was regarded as a significant hymn of the Reformation. But it was seen primarily not as a triumphalistic hymn, but rather as a hymn of comfort. And that is exactly what Luther himself put at the heading of this hymn in the earliest source that we know of, a hymn of comfort. And therefore, its primary use, certainly up until the 18th century, its primary use, though it did occur on Reformation days, but its primary use was for a hymn during Lent, a penitential season of Lent. And therefore, the first version of what was to become Bach's chorale cantata on Luther's famous hymn was composed for Oculi, the third Sunday in Lent, Alles von Gott geboren, BWV 80A, and first performed in the Weimar Court Chapel in March 1715. And the libretto has very strong echoes of Luther's text, but doesn't quote it verbatim, except for the final chorale, which is stanza 2 in this early version, stanza 2 of Luther's hymn, Mit unser Macht ist nicht getan. Then, sometime between 1728 and 1731, it was performed in Leipzig on the annual Reformation Festival held on the 31st of October. We don't know the exact year. For this occasion, the Weimar version of the cantata was left untouched, except that now, at the beginning, before the movement that had begun, the Weimar version, there is a four-part setting, a simple, straightforward four-part setting of the kind that we normally associate with the end of cantatas becomes, so this version has two four-part chorales, one at the beginning and one at the end. And this is BWV 80B. Then a few years later, sometime in the 1730s, Bach returned to Luther's Reformation hymn and reworked the earlier Weimar cantata by adding newly composed movements, and using more of Luther's familiar text, thus making it into a definite chorale cantata. Ein fester Berg ist unser Gott, BWV 80. Now, as you've already discovered, the opening chorus is a contrapuntal tour de force, 228 measures, the longest and the most complex vocal movement that Bach ever wrote. And it was written for this famous text by Martin Luther. But there's another detail that is sometimes not commented on, and that is this. You hear the melody in its later isometric form, equal notes. Bum, 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 bum. And you know the rest of it. But underneath, dum da 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 dum da da dum dum da da dum dum dum, underneath. Well, if you look at the earliest version of Luther's, the original form of Luther's melody, it's very rhythmical. So what Bach is doing here is accepting the form of the melody as it was then sung, but the counterpoint underneath seems to suggest that he also knew that in origin it was much more a rhythmical version. But then Bach also composed cantatas on other chorales by Luther. Although there is no direct evidence, it seems that the Leipzig churches were observing another Reformation anniversary in the year 1724. This year marks the bicentenary of the first Lutheran hymnals that appeared in 1524. So it's the bicentenary, 1524, 1724. And it seems that Bach and the Leipzig clergy wanted to observe this bicentenary throughout the year. So at the beginning of his second year in Leipzig, on Trinity Sunday, 1724, Bach began performing a significant sequence of chorale cantatas. Cantatas that were based on well-known and well-loved classic Lutheran hymns. Of the 40 cantatas in this sequence, no less than 10 were on chorales by Luther. Ach Gott von Himmel zieht herein, Cantata 2. Christ uns Herr zum Jordan kam, Cantata 7. Meine Seele erhebt den Herrn, the Magnificat from Luther's New Testament, BWV 10. Aus tiefer Not schrei ich zu dir, Cantata 38. Nun kommt der Heiden Heiland, Cantata 62, his second version. He composed an earlier version. Gelobet seist du, Jesu Christ, Cantata 91a. Christen wir sollen loben schon, Cantata 121. Mit Frieden, Freud, ich fahr dahin, Cantata 125. Erholt uns, Herr, bei deinem Wort, Cantata 126. And Christ lag in Todesbanden, Cantata 4, because he repeated what he had composed earlier, because it was such a good cantata. In the organ works, there are quite a number of chorale preludes on the melodies of Luther's hymns, such as the small-scale settings that we find in the organ bookline, but especially in the large-scale settings of the so-called Leipzig chorales, or the Great 18, though I think they should be called the Great 15 plus others, where we find these very impressive settings of Komm Gott Schöpfer Heiliger Geist, BWV 667, two settings of Komm Heiliger Geist Herr Gott, BWV 651, 652, two settings of Jesus Christus unser Heiland, 665, 666, and the three settings of Nun komm the Haydn Highland, BWV 659 to 661. But perhaps the most significant of the organ works connected with Luther are to be found in the chorale preludes of Bach's Klavierbund Part 3, which was published in 1739, and this is going to be talked about much and demonstrations next week. It was published in 1739, yet another Reformation year, certainly in Leipzig, because at Pentecost, 1539, the Reformation was introduced into Leipzig, and it was introduced no less than by Martin Luther, who preached in the Thomas Church to introduce the Reformation, and it was on Pentecost. So there is a strong possibility that Bach was honoring this bicentenary with these remarkable organ pieces. Over the years, Luther created a sequence of hymns on each part of the Catechism: Ten Commandments, Die 10 Heiligen 10 Gebot; Creed, Wir glauben alle an einen Gott; Lord's Prayer, Vater unser im Himmelreich; Baptism, Christ unser Herr zum Jordankamm; Penitence, Aus tiefer Not schrei ich zu dir; and Lord's Supper, Jesus Christus unser Heiland. Now, in the Klavierbund, Bach sets each of the melodies of these catechism hymns. He sets them twice. And the headings of each of these paired chorale preludes indicate that the first one is for manuals and pedal, a larger instrument implied, and that the second one is for manuals without pedal, manuals alone, implying an instrument without pedals. In each pairing, the first one is for manuals and pedal is an extensive setting of the particular melody, and the second is on a much smaller scale for manuals alone on the same melody. Though one has to say that although it would be easy to say that the first one is difficult, the second one is simple. No way. There is as much compositional ingenuity in the manual settings as is found in the larger settings. So in a sense, there are two settings of the same substance: one for a larger instrument, one for a smaller instrument. In order to further the theological content of the Reformation in 1529, Luther first created the small catechism that covered the basic areas of commandments, creed, prayer, baptism, penitence, Lord's Supper. The catechism was published, and every head of the household was to teach his or her family the substance of the catechism, and to do so regularly. But Luther also decreed that the clergy should teach the substance of the catechism week by week at Sunday Vespers and at other times as well. In order to assist the clergy in their teaching of this basic theology, Luther wrote the large catechism, which was also first published in 1529. Thereafter, there was the small catechism for the people and the large catechism for the clergy. But both catechisms share the same substance. The small catechism in a less complex manner, the large catechism the same substance, but at greater length and greater depth. It seems to me that Bach understood Luther on this perfectly. since he followed the example of Luther's catechisms by treating Luther's catechism hymns in two different ways. One more direct, the other more discursive, but both sharing the same substance. Thus, Luther's two catechisms prompted Bach to compose two settings of each of Luther's catechism hymns. So, one way or another, and taking all these connections into account, it would not be too extravagant to conclude that Luther was held in very high regard by Johann Sebastian Bach. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robin, for this very, very interesting lecture, and proving certainly that when we talk